A baby abandoned in a wreckage on a stormy mountain road. A lone wolf drawn by the cries of an innocent life. A desperate search. A mother and father clinging to hope. A bond formed between predator and protector. A mystery that defies nature. The storm hit without warning. One moment, the road was clear, the sky a muted gray. The next, it was as if the heavens themselves were cracking open. Lightning flashed so brightly it painted the world in sharp strokes of white and blue. The wind screamed through the trees, forcing the car into a wild, uncontrollable swerve. A downpour followed, thick as ink, drenching the road in seconds. The car, a small sedan, was the only thing alive on the winding mountain pass. The tires squealed in protest as the rain turned the road slick. The couple, Eva and Ben, exchanged nervous glances, their fingers gripping the wheel and the passenger seat tighter as they navigated the treacherous curves.
This is crazy.
Eva muttered, her voice swallowed by the howl of the wind.
We should have turned back.
Ben, trying to stay calm, adjusted the wipers, but they struggled to clear the sheets of water.
Just a little longer,
He replied, glancing at the map on his phone, now blinking with low battery.
we'll be through this in a minute.
Their baby, Leah, cooed softly in the back seat, oblivious to the storm's fury. Eva smiled at the sound, a small comfort amidst the chaos. Leah was only 6 months old, her small, chubby hands reaching for anything they could grasp, her eyes wide with curiosity. Eva had always dreamed of showing her daughter the world, and now they were taking their first road trip together. But just as they crested a particularly steep curve, the wind howled with an unnatural ferocity. The tires lost their grip on the slick asphalt. The car swerved violently, slipping off the edge of the road, its metal frame scraping against the rocks. Eva screamed, reaching out toward the dashboard, her heart racing. Ben fought to regain control, but it was too late. The car tumbled over the edge, the world spinning in a dizzying blur. Time stretched, then collapsed into an instant. The crash was deafening, glass shattering, metal twisting. The car slammed into the jagged rocks below, crumpling like a tin can. The rain pounded against the wreckage as though trying to erase all evidence of the accident, the storm's fury growing louder by the second. In the wreckage, the world went silent. Ben and Eva were motionless. Blood pooled beneath them, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their bodies were slumped against the broken windows, lifeless in the aftermath of the crash. Their breaths were shallow, their hearts faint and erratic. But there was another sound, the faintest whimper. Leah. The baby, still strapped in her seat, had somehow survived. Her cries were soft at first, weak against the storm's howling wind, but they grew louder, desperate. Her tiny hands pressed against the seatbelt, trying to push herself upright. But the car was twisted and pinned against the rocks, her movements confined. From the forest nearby, a pair of amber eyes glinted in the darkness. The lone wolf, sensing movement and the faintest whiff of human scent, paused. Its muscles tensed, its nose twitching in the damp air. The creature's instincts were primal, honed over countless generations. It could smell the blood, the desperation, the life that remained in the wreckage. The wolf's fur ruffled against the wind, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it took one cautious step forward, sniffing the air again. Its ears twitched, hearing the baby's cries. Something about the sound, the vulnerability, the helplessness, pulled at something deep within the wolf's chest. It was an unusual feeling, one it didn't quite understand, but it couldn't ignore the pull. The wolf crept closer, its movements fluid and silent. The storm raged on around it, but the wolf was focused, intent. It didn't know what it would find at the crash site, but it could sense that this moment, this strange call from the wreckage, was meant for it. With the baby's cries growing more frantic in the distance, the wolf moved forward, cautiously stepping through the dense trees and into the edge of the wreckage. It had no clear plan, no intention other than to investigate. But as the wolf neared the overturned car, its heart began to beat faster, drawn to the faint sound of life still clinging to the air. And so, the wolf moved closer to the wreckage, its every step deliberate, ready to face whatever it would discover in the chaos of the storm. The wolf stood at the edge of the wreckage, its senses alive, sharp in the chaos of the storm. The air was thick with the scent of blood, rain, and something else, a faint, helpless cry. Its amber eyes scanned the twisted metal and broken glass, ears twitching at every sound. The wind howled, the rain lashed against its fur, but the wolf's focus remained on the wreck. It was accustomed to the wilderness, to survival. But this was different. There was something about the tiny cries that stirred something deep within. For a long moment, the wolf hesitated. Its instinct screamed at it to retreat, to avoid the strange scent of humans. Its territory was vast, untamed, and it had survived alone for years without interference. Predators didn't care for the weak. They didn't protect what wasn't their own. But something within the wolf resisted the urge to turn away. The baby's cries were fragile, weak, like the sound of a wounded animal, something in need of help. A flicker of curiosity, then concern, wove through its thoughts. The wolf's gaze flicked over the wreckage again, its sharp senses picking out the shape of the small bundle in the broken car. It could smell the child, tiny, vulnerable, but alive. Still, the wolf didn't move. Its paws were rooted to the ground, its instincts at war with the pull of something else, something unfamiliar. But then a sharp wail pierced the air, higher, more desperate. The wolf flinched. It had heard many sounds in the forest, the rustle of prey in the underbrush, the hoots of owls, the distant calls of its pack. But this cry, a child's cry, struck a different chord. The wolf's protective instincts, honed over countless hunts and encounters, kicked in. It felt a strange tug, something primal yet tender. The wolf stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate. The wind howled louder, but it was no longer afraid. It didn't know what it was about this moment, about this child, but something told it it had to act. It approached the wreckage, sniffing the air again. The baby was there, crying with trembling breasts, wedged in the car seat. There was a soft, broken sound as the wolf nudged the door with its nose, using the force of its head to push the mangled metal away. With careful, almost gentle movements, the wolf reached inside the car. Its claws scraped against the upholstery as it carefully grasped the baby's blanket, the small form cradled in its jaws. The wolf didn't know why it did it. It didn't think. It just acted. Its sharp teeth avoided the child's fragile body, the tension in its muscles releasing as it gently maneuvered the baby free. Once it had the baby, it paused. The little one's cries had stopped, replaced by weak, gasping breaths. The wolf instinctively tucked the baby closer, its warmth a comfort against the storm's chill. It could feel the warmth of the child's small body, the rhythm of its breath, and it moved, slowly, carefully, away from the wreckage, back into the forest. The storm raged around them, but the wolf's focus remained unbroken. It trotted along the damp earth, heading deeper into the woods, its eyes darting from side to side. Every now and then, it would glance down at the baby nestled in its jaws, checking for signs of movement. There was a sense of urgency, though the wolf wasn't sure why. The child wasn't safe yet, not in the open. But there was something instinctual about the way it held the baby. It was natural to protect, to shelter the vulnerable. The forest stretched out before them, dense and dark, the towering trees swaying in the wind. The wolf's paws struck the earth with quiet precision, navigating the underbrush with ease. It was a creature of the wild, alone in its domain, but now it felt the weight of responsibility, an unfamiliar burden. It found a den not far from the wreckage, a hollow beneath a thick oak tree. The entrance was narrow but large enough for the wolf to slip inside with the baby. Once inside, the wolf carefully laid the child on the ground, its body pressed close to the warmth of the little one. The storm continued its violent dance outside, but in the den, the wolf's presence provided a sense of security. The wolf curled around the baby, its fur creating a natural barrier against the cold. The child stirred slightly, a faint whimper escaping its lips. The wolf's breath slowed, its instincts softened. It could feel the child's warmth against its own, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The storm continued to rage through the night, the wind howling and the rain pounding the earth. But in the den, the wolf and the baby were quiet. The wolf's body curled protectively around the child, keeping it safe, its warmth acting as a shield against the chill. The world outside might have been wild, untamed, but inside this small, dark space, there was peace. And as the storm slowly faded, the wolf's breathing evened out, its watchful eyes closing for a moment, its heart strangely at ease. It had made its choice. The baby was safe. Over the next few days, the wolf's world began to shift. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant rumble of thunder. The forest, once a place of isolation and danger, had become something else. An oasis, a place of shelter. And at the center of it all, the wolf found itself bound to a tiny, helpless creature it had never known. The baby, now resting in a soft nest of leaves and moss, was no longer the frightened bundle it had been on that first night. It had settled, its cries turning into calm coos and quiet gurgles. It reached out for the wolf, its small hands grasping at the air. And when the wolf came near, the baby's face softened, the eyes bright with curiosity. It wasn't yet old enough to understand the significance of the bond, but instinctively it recognized something in the wolf. The wolf, for its part, responded with a tenderness that surprised even it. It had never thought of itself as a caretaker. It had survived on its own for so long, fending for itself in a world where only the strong endured. But now it was something more. It was a protector, a guardian, a silent partner in this strange and delicate dance between predator and prey. Each morning, the wolf ventured out from the den, moving swiftly through the underbrush. Its sharp eyes scanned the forest floor, alert to every sound. The forest was full of life, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional distant call of a deer. The wolf's senses were tuned to the smallest details, and it moved with the grace of a shadow, its paws barely making a sound as it hunted. It brought back small meals for the baby, small rodents, birds, and the occasional fish from a nearby stream. The wolf's jaws were careful as it tore the meat apart, making sure to avoid any sharp bones that could harm the baby. It placed the food near the child, nudging it closer with its nose until the baby could grasp it in its tiny hands. Each day the baby grew stronger. The cries became less frequent, replaced by the soft hums of a creature beginning to understand the world around it. The baby's gaze would often follow the wolf as it moved, its dark eyes wide with wonder. Sometimes the wolf would rest nearby, its fur a comforting shield against the chill of the forest air. At times when the wolf was away hunting, the baby would call out, a high, soft wail that carried through the trees. The wolf would return quickly, its powerful legs carrying it back to the den in short, quick bursts. It would find the baby waiting, a small bundle of warmth and need, and it would curl around the little one once more, offering what protection it could. The bond was undeniable. As the days passed, the two became more in tune with each other. The baby, once a fragile creature in need of constant care, was slowly becoming stronger. The wolf, once solitary, was becoming something else, something that cared for another life. Yet not all was as it seemed. The pack, the wolf's kin, had been watching. At first they kept their distance, observing from the edges of the forest. There were 6 of them, all part of the same bloodline. But the lone wolf was different. It had always been an outlier, solitary by nature. The pack had never understood its need for solitude, its tendency to roam alone. They watched from the shadows of the trees, their eyes glowing in the dim light, their forms barely visible in the underbrush. The older wolves, especially the alpha, were cautious. They could sense something had changed in the lone wolf, but they couldn't quite place it. It wasn't natural for one of their own to care for a human infant. Their instincts told them to protect, to guard, but the sight of their kin, so different from the wild creatures they knew, made them hesitate. From time to time, the pack would move closer. They would circle the den at night, keeping a careful watch, but they never interfered. They were curious, but they also knew better than to challenge the lone wolf. There was something in the way it carried itself now, something that made them pause. They knew it wasn't the same wolf that had once hunted with them, the one who had stood apart from the group. This wolf was different, and they didn't know what to make of it. The wolf, for its part, felt the presence of its pack. It would catch fleeting glimpses of them, silhouettes in the trees, flickers of movement in the underbrush. But it did not approach them. It kept its distance, focusing instead on the baby. The pack was a reminder of what it had once been, but it was also a reminder of what it had chosen to leave behind. The forest itself was alive with sounds. The wind rustling the leaves, the distant gurgle of the stream as it wound its way through the trees, the soft whispers of the earth beneath the wolf's paws. The wolf moved through this world with purpose, its eyes scanning the horizon for threats, its ears constantly flicking at the smallest sound. The world was always in motion, but the baby, curled in the warmth of its den, was at peace. Every now and then, the wolf would stop by the stream, pausing to drink the cool water, its reflection rippling in the current. It would glance back at the den, its heart steady with a strange sense of duty. It had become a guardian in a way it had never imagined. The bond between the wolf and the baby deepened with each passing day. There was no need for words, no need for understanding, beyond the quiet rhythm of life in the forest. The wolf watched over the child, and in turn, the baby responded with trust, with the soft touch of tiny fingers reaching out when the wolf returned from its hunts. They were not bound by words, but by something older, something more ancient, the bond between protector and protected, between the wild and the fragile. And so the days passed, the forest alive with its ceaseless motion, and the wolf, with the baby nestled against its side, began to understand the delicate balance of life, how it could be both fierce and tender, both a hunter and a caretaker. In this strange union, something beautiful was born, a bond formed between predator and prey, a story older than time itself. The first thing Eva noticed when she woke up was the sharp, sterile smell of the hospital. It was almost enough to make her gag. Her head throbbed, and the world around her seemed muffled, distant. She blinked against the brightness of the white walls and the sound of beeping monitors. For a moment, she didn't remember what had happened. But then the memories came rushing back. The storm, the car swerving, the crash.
Ben,
She whispered, her voice weak. She turned her head, her gaze searching the room. Ben was sitting beside her, his face pale and drawn. His hand gripped hers tightly, but his eyes were wide with panic. He wasn't focused on her. He was staring at something beyond her, his mouth moving, but not forming words.
Ben,
Eva said again, her voice louder this time, desperate for answers. Ben turned to her, his expression clouded with confusion and fear.
Eva, Leah. Where's Leah?
The question hung between them like a thick, suffocating fog. Eva's heart skipped a beat. She searched her foggy memory for the last thing she could remember. Her baby, Leah in the back seat, crying. But the details were blurry, the pieces scattered. She tried to sit up, but the pain in her head flared, forcing her back down.
Leah's gone, isn't she?
Eva whispered, her throat tight with the sting of tears. Ben's face crumpled. He stood, pacing at the foot of the bed.
They said they found the car, but no sign of her. She's gone, Eva.
His voice was hoarse, the words like daggers, each one more painful than the last. Eva closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it all. Her baby, her precious little girl, was missing. The fear and hopelessness gnawed at her insides, leaving a hollow ache. Minutes, hours, or perhaps days later, a nurse entered the room with a quiet knock. She had a kind face, but her eyes were filled with sympathy, eyes that spoke of bad news.
Your family is here.
The nurse said gently, but there was a hesitation in her voice. Eva nodded, her heart heavy, knowing what the nurse wasn't saying. Ben, who had been pacing, stopped abruptly when his mother and father entered. They had been called in after the crash, but they had no answers, no reassurances, only pain and questions they couldn't answer.
Eva, Ben.
Her mother-in-law's voice broke as she embraced them both. She wiped her eyes before looking at her son.
Have you heard anything, any news of Leah?
Ben shook his head.
No, not yet. But they're starting a search party.
Eva's heart clung to that. Hope. The possibility that her baby was still out there somewhere, waiting for them. She had to believe it. A search party was organized within hours of the crash. Rescuers, volunteers, trackers, and even a few seasoned forest guides were brought in. Word had spread fast. News of the missing baby, the crash, and the perilous search through the dangerous wilderness. Eva and Ben had no choice but to stay behind, helpless. The storm had already passed, but the forest was thick with trees, and the area was rugged and dangerous. Eva sat in the hospital bed, her hands shaking as she clutched the blanket. She could hear the voices of the searchers outside, their hushed tones and urgent footsteps echoing in the halls. Her parents-in-law had left for the woods, and Eva and Ben were left to wait. The hours dragged by, and each minute felt like a day. The pain in Eva's chest only deepened the longer they waited. Ben's eyes were dark, haunted. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He was consumed by the thought of Leah. Somewhere deep in the forest, the search party began their work. The trackers were the first to lead the way. They moved with swift efficiency, their eyes scanning the forest floor for any sign of movement. They found the wreckage quickly, the crumpled car still wedged against the rocks. There was a trail of shredded blankets, bits of cloth that fluttered in the wind like scraps of broken dreams. One of the trackers crouched beside a patch of dirt.
Look here.
He murmured, pointing to a set of tracks.
These aren't human. They're wolf tracks.
A murmur of disbelief rippled through the searchers. Wolves weren't uncommon in these woods, but the idea that a wolf could have taken the baby, taken Leah, felt impossible. The searchers huddled together, discussing what to do next. Ben and Eva were not there to witness the tracks, but word quickly reached them. The news sent another wave of panic through Eva's chest. A wolf? Had the baby been taken by a wild animal? Her mind raced with horror, but she pushed the thoughts away. Leah was alive. She had to be alive.
Could she still be alive?
Ben asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. His eyes were wide, frantic. The idea of his daughter in the paws of a wolf sent terror through him. But the tracks, they could mean something else, something more hopeful. The search party wasn't so sure. Some argued that the tracks could mean the baby was lost and helpless, while others believed that the wolf had taken the child for a different reason, to protect, to shelter. There was a strange tension in the air. The debate became heated, with some volunteers unsure whether to continue, fearing the worst. Others refused to give up, holding on to the slim hope that the wolf's tracks might mean Leah was still alive. Hours passed and the tracks led deeper into the woods. The searchers followed, hesitant but determined. Each step felt heavier, the weight of uncertainty bearing down on them. The wolf tracks were clear, and the path led away from the car, toward the thick forest beyond. The tension between the searchers continued to grow as they neared the den. The forest was thick and silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant sound of rushing water. But every movement, every crack of a branch underfoot seemed to stretch time. They were getting closer. Would they find the baby, or would they discover that it was too late? But with each step forward, one thing was clear. The forest was holding its secrets close. Only the wolf knew where the baby was, and whether or not it was still alive. The search party pressed deeper into the dense forest, the daylight fading with each step. The air was thick with the smell of pine and earth, the sounds of rustling leaves punctuated by the occasional call of distant birds. Their eyes were trained on the wolf tracks, the imprints sharp and clear despite the underbrush and uneven ground. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around them, enveloping them in silence and shadow. It had been hours since they'd first found the tracks, and now they were close. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The tension was palpable. Every footstep, every crack of a twig beneath their boots felt like a ticking clock. And then the guide, a rugged tracker with a weathered face, held up a hand to signal the others to stop. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the forest ahead.
"There's something up ahead,"
He whispered.
"Stay quiet."
The group froze. They could hear it now, the faint sound of movement, the rustle of leaves. The air felt heavy, charged with the unknown. They followed the guide in silence, moving cautiously through the thick undergrowth until they reached a small clearing in the forest. There, nestled in the center, was a small den, shallow yet well-formed, surrounded by tall ferns and moss. The scent of the wolf was strong here, and the hairs on the back of their necks prickled. But it was not the wolf that had drawn their attention. It was the tiny figure at the heart of the den. Leah. The baby lay in a nest of moss and leaves, her small form curled up and peaceful. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in the soft rhythm of sleep. There was no sign of distress, no sign that she had been harmed. In fact, she seemed to be resting comfortably. The care the wolf had taken in arranging the surrounding leaves clear in the soft, protective cocoon it had created. For a long moment, the search party stood frozen, their breath caught in their throats. It was a sight they had not expected. The baby, so small and vulnerable, cradled by the very forest itself, its wild protector standing guard. But the moment was quickly broken. From the shadows the wolf emerged. Its form was imposing, its fur a dark, mottled mix of gray and black, eyes glowing amber in the dimming light. It stood tall, muscles rippling beneath its sleek fur, its posture tense and watchful. A low growl rumbled from its chest, a clear warning. The search party instinctively took a step back, their hands reaching for their weapons. But the tracker, the leader of the search, motioned for calm, keeping his voice low and steady.
Don't provoke it. Let's not escalate.
The wolf's growl deepened, a protective sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. It did not move toward them, but it did not take its eyes off them either. Its gaze remained fixed on the baby, who now stirred at the noise, her tiny hands stretching outward. The wolf tensed, its lips curling slightly in warning, but it did not attack. Instead, it moved slightly, positioning itself between the baby and the approaching humans. Ben and Eva, who had been holding their breath from the edge of the clearing, could hardly believe their eyes. There in front of them was their daughter, alive, safe, and protected by the very creature they had feared. The sight of the baby, nestled in the leaves and moss, made Eva's heart swell with relief. But there was no time for hesitation, no time to fully process the surreal scene. They needed to act. They needed to bring their daughter back.
Leah!
Eva's voice cracked as she called out softly, desperate but gentle.
Leah, sweetie, it's Mommy. It's Daddy.
The wolf's amber eyes flickered briefly toward Eva, its gaze assessing, weighing the threat. Eva took a cautious step forward, her hands trembling as she extended them toward the baby. Her voice was soothing, a low, calming murmur meant to convey nothing but love and safety. The wolf growled again, louder this time, its fur bristling. It stood taller, its body tense, unwilling to back down. But Eva's words carried the weight of a mother's plea.
Leah, sweetheart, come to Mommy.
She whispered, her voice breaking with emotion.
We're here. We won't leave you.
For a long moment, nothing moved. The baby's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her mother's voice, and her small, innocent gaze locked onto Eva's face. A soft gurgle escaped her lips, and her arms stretched toward the woman she knew. The wolf hesitated, its amber eyes narrowed, assessing the situation. For a second, the standoff seemed endless, the forest holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Then, with a subtle shift, the wolf stepped back, its body lowering but its eyes still watching carefully. Eva stepped forward, her heart pounding as she reached out to scoop up her daughter. The baby's tiny body fit perfectly in her arms, and Eva held her close, feeling the warmth and life return to her own body with every second that passed. Ben was by her side in an instant, his face streaked with tears of relief as he gently touched his daughter's head.
We've got you.
He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The wolf lingered at the edge of the clearing, its eyes locked on the family, unblinking. It watched them silently, its body still coiled with tension. There was no sign of aggression, only a deep, instinctual vigilance, protective, wary, yet respectful of the bond that had just been formed. The searchers, still frozen in place, slowly began to exhale, their tension easing as they realized the danger had passed. They watched the wolf for a moment longer, their faces filled with awe and respect. The wild animal had acted out of something pure, something deeper than survival. After a long pause, the wolf took a final glance at the baby, its amber eyes lingering for just a moment before it turned away. With a slow, measured stride, it disappeared into the trees, its silhouette fading into the shadows. The forest, once ominous and full of danger, now felt peaceful. The family was whole again, reunited in the way only nature could have orchestrated. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the searchers quietly made their way back, leaving the family in their moment of solace. But the wolf's presence would remain with them, a quiet guardian who had protected a life, not out of instinct to hunt, but out of an understanding older than time itself. The forest had given the baby back to her parents, but the bond between the child and the wild would never be forgotten. As the family stood in the clearing, the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Leah, now safely cradled in her mother's arms, cooed softly, a sound of peace, of safety. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the rustling of leaves and distant calls of wildlife momentarily silenced. And then the wolf howled. It was a mournful sound, echoing through the trees, long and drawn out, carrying a strange sorrow with it. The sound was haunting, almost human-like in its tone, a cry that seemed to mourn something lost, something understood only by the wild. Leah stirred in Eva's arms. Her tiny hand reached out, her face serene, as if she too understood the depth of the wolf's call. A soft coo escaped her lips, almost a reply, as though the baby could sense the bond she shared with the creature that had guarded her, sheltered her in the forest's heart. The search party, standing at the edge of the clearing, exchanged looks of disbelief. They had witnessed so much already, the tracks, the den, the standoff, but this moment felt different. The wolf's howl wasn't just an animal's cry, it was something deeper, something more profound. It was a farewell, a recognition of the child's survival, and an acknowledgement of its role in that survival. The group stood still, entranced by the sound, as the air shifted, thick with mystery and awe. There was a connection here, one that could never be fully understood, yet felt deeply by all who witnessed it. The wolf had not merely protected the baby out of instinct or hunger. There was something almost sacred in its actions, a rare and untold understanding between species, a bond woven in the wildness of the forest. Slowly, the wolf's howl faded, its echo lingering long after the sound itself was gone. The clearing grew quiet again, the world returning to its natural rhythm. But the wolf did not approach them further. It stood at the edge of the forest, its amber eyes meeting the eyes of the family one last time. Eva felt her heart tighten. There was something in the wolf's gaze, something that spoke of a promise, of protection, of silent gratitude. It was not a creature that sought praise or recognition, but in that moment, it seemed to acknowledge the importance of its actions. Its role in saving Leah was complete. It had done what nature had called it to do, and now it would vanish as silently as it had appeared. The wolf turned, its body flowing with the grace of the wild. It moved with purpose, disappearing into the trees, its silhouette swallowed by the shadows of the forest. For a moment, no one spoke. The forest felt different now, alive with the weight of what had transpired. The search party, the parents, the wolves. They were all part of something greater, something untold and unspeakable. Eva and Ben stood together, holding their daughter close, the sound of the wolf's howl still reverberating in their minds. The world had shifted in that brief moment. A child had been saved by a creature that was not bound by the same laws as humankind, but rather by something older, more instinctual. And as the wolf vanished into the forest, so did the mystery of its protection, leaving behind only the unanswered question of why. But the forest, as always, would keep its secrets, and Leah would grow, knowing that in the depths of the wild, she had been watched over, not by man, but by the very heart of nature itself. Back in the warmth of their home, the world felt different. It was as if the air itself carried a new weight, a sense of profound gratitude. Eva and Ben sat together, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in the crib, her tiny fingers curled around a soft blanket. The memory of the wolf's amber eyes, its silent watchfulness, lingered in their hearts. They had been given a second chance, a gift they could never repay. As they sat in the quiet of their living room, Eva spoke first, her voice soft, filled with reverence.
We have to teach her.
She said, looking toward Ben.
We have to teach her to respect nature, to understand what the wild can offer, and what it can take away.
Ben nodded, his expression thoughtful.
The wolf gave her something we can't explain. It protected her, kept her alive. We need to make sure she understands the balance, the responsibility that comes with living in this world.
From that day forward, their daughter, Leah, grew up with an innate fascination for wolves in the wild. She would often stand at the window, gazing toward the forest, her eyes filled with wonder and curiosity. She loved the stories her parents told her, stories of a wolf that had saved her life and disappeared into the trees, leaving only the echo of its howl behind. It was a story that became a local legend, passed down from one generation to the next, a tale of mysterious connection between humans and animals, of compassion and trust between creatures of different worlds. The forest, once a place of fear and uncertainty, became a symbol of life and resilience to the family. Leah grew up knowing the forest was both a sanctuary and a mystery, and every time she wandered near its edge, she would pause, as if waiting for something, listening for a sound only she could hear. As she grew older, Leah's connection to the wild deepened. She studied animals, their behaviors, and their ecosystems, learning everything she could about the creatures that roamed the land. But no matter how much she learned, no matter how many books she read or documentaries she watched, there was always something more to discover, something beyond human understanding. One autumn evening, when Leah was 16, she found herself standing at the edge of the forest again, just as she had so many times before. The air was cool, the sky painted with the last hues of sunset. She could feel the wind against her face, the smell of pine and earth filling her lungs. It felt like the forest was calling to her, its deep green heart alive with memory and mystery. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her gaze fixed on the line where the trees met the open field. In the distance, the woods seemed to move, as if something large was shifting through the shadows. Leah's heart raced, a feeling of anticipation rising within her chest. And then, just for a moment, the forest was still. She heard nothing, no birds, no rustling leaves, no movement in the brush. But she felt it. She could feel the presence of something watching her, something familiar yet elusive. A chill ran down her spine, not from fear, but from recognition. She didn't know why, but she knew. The wolf was there. Its spirit was still part of this forest, part of her life. And though she couldn't see it, she could feel its watchful eyes on her, just as they had been so many years ago, when it had saved her life. Leah smiled softly to herself, the wind brushing her hair back as she turned to walk toward home. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't alone. The wolf, in its mysterious way, would always be there. Part of her, part of the wild, and part of the world she had come to love. And as she walked away, the first sound she heard was a single howl, faint but distinct, carried on the wind. A farewell, a reminder, a promise kept. The forest and the bond between humans and animals was alive in her, always.